In my 4 decades of banking experience, I've seen many financial crises, market crashes, and economic upheavals, but what I'm witnessing today represents perhaps the most insidious threat to individual wealth that I've encountered: the systematic destruction of purchasing power for anyone holding cash. At JPMorgan Chase, managing over $3.7 trillion in client assets, we're doing something unprecedented, actively advising clients to minimize cash holdings. Not because cash has become risky in the traditional sense, but because keeping money in savings accounts has become the most dangerous long-term financial strategy available today. This isn't sales rhetoric. This is an institutional warning based on macroeconomic analysis showing cash holders face guaranteed wealth destruction at rates not seen since the 1970s inflationary period. The difference is that today's destruction is more subtle, persistent, and structurally embedded in our financial system. Most people see FDIC insurance and stable principal balances, feeling confident about their financial position, but this safety perception is an illusion costing millions of Americans their financial futures. Cash and savings accounts paying 1% to 2% while inflation runs 4% to 6% represents guaranteed purchasing power loss of 2% to 4% annually, 30% wealth destruction over a decade. At JP Morgan, our economic research team projects this inflationary environment isn't temporary, it's structural. Government debt levels exceeding $34 trillion, demographic trends, deglobalization pressures, infrastructure spending requirements, and monetary policy constraints create persistent inflationary forces that will continue eroding cash values for years to come. The first major threat facing cash holders is the inflation that's already destroying purchasing power faster than savings accounts can preserve it. The first major threat facing cash holders is inflation destroying purchasing power faster than savings accounts can preserve it. Official inflation statistics show 3% to 5% annual increases, but these significantly understate real inflation experienced by most families. Government calculations use methodologies that minimize reported inflation through substitution effects and weightings that don't reflect actual spending patterns. Real-world inflation runs much higher. Housing costs increased 20% to 40% in many markets over 3 years. Food prices rose 15% to 25%. Energy costs trend consistently higher. Healthcare expenses continue growing faster than overall inflation, while educational costs compound at rates exceeding general price levels. At JP Morgan, we track lived inflation, actual price increases for goods families regularly purchase. Our analysis shows real inflation for middle-class families averages 5% to 8% annually. This gap between actual inflation and savings yields creates guaranteed wealth destruction. A family with $100,000 in savings earning 2% while experiencing 6% actual inflation loses $4,000 purchasing power annually. Over 10 years, their $100,000 becomes equivalent to approximately $67,000 in today's purchasing power, despite growing to $122,000 in nominal terms. The compound effect accelerates over time. Unlike market volatility that moves up and down, inflation-driven purchasing power loss is directional and persistent. There's no recovery mechanism for purchasing power lost to inflation. Once prices rise, they rarely fall back to previous levels. The psychological impact is insidious because it's invisible. Bank statements show growing balances from interest, creating false confidence while actual purchasing power steadily declines. People see larger numbers and feel wealthier while their real financial position deteriorates month by month. The second major threat is the unprecedented fiscal and monetary policies creating structural inflationary pressures. The second major threat is unprecedented fiscal and monetary policies creating structural inflationary pressures. Government debt exceeds $34 trillion and grows by over $1 trillion annually, creating pressure for inflationary policies that reduce real debt burden through currency debasement. At JP Morgan, our fiscal analysis shows traditional deficit reduction through spending cuts or tax increases has become politically impossible. Federal Reserve policy remains accommodative despite inflation rhetoric. Real interest rates, nominal rates minus inflation, remain negative or barely positive, providing continued stimulus that supports asset prices while eroding cash value. The Fed's dual mandate creates bias toward inflationary policies during economic uncertainty. Quantitative easing created massive excess liquidity still flowing through the economy with delayed effects, money supply expansion continues working through price levels, meaning current inflation likely understates future pressures. The political economy favors debtors over savers. Government policies consistently support borrowers through low rates and programs that socialize losses while privatizing gains. Cash holders receive no political advocacy because they represent creditors rather than debtors. The third threat facing cash holders is currency debasement driven by competitive global monetary policies. The The U.S. dollar faces long-term challenges from fiscal deficits, monetary accommodation, and strategic competitors developing alternative payment systems. At JPMorgan, we see growing momentum toward currency diversification as China, Russia, and others develop payment systems bypassing dollar infrastructure. Domestic currency debasement occurs through monetary policy prioritizing financial stability over currency purchasing power. The Federal Reserve's implicit framework accepts moderate inflation as preferable to economic disruption, creating systematic bias toward currency depreciation. Historical analysis shows major economies consistently choose currency debasement over economic contraction when facing unsustainable debt burdens. Modern monetary theory provides intellectual justification for extensive money creation previously considered dangerous, reducing policymaker resistance to inflationary policies. The fourth major risk is opportunity cost of missing investment returns while holding depreciating cash. Stock markets historically provide 8% to 12% annual returns, including dividends. Real estate typically keeps pace with or exceeds inflation while providing income and tax advantages. At JPMorgan, our analysis shows diversified portfolios have consistently outperformed cash over all rolling 10-year periods since World War II. The mathematical impact compounds dramatically. The difference between 2% cash returns and 8% investment returns creates substantial wealth differences over decades. A $100,000 investment growing at 8% annually reaches $466,000 after 20 years, while cash at 2% reaches only $149,000, a $317,000 difference. The fifth risk is systematic policy bias against savers in favor of borrowers and investors. Government tax policies favor borrowers through mortgage deductions and capital gains treatment while providing no comparable benefits for cash savings. At JPMorgan, we see consistent policy momentum supporting asset prices through accommodation and stimulus, policies that systematically transfer wealth from cash holders to asset owners. Financial repression keeps interest rates artificially low relative to inflation, creating negative real returns for cash while supporting borrowers and governments with high debt burdens. Political dynamics favor borrowers who vote based on interest rates over savers who vote based on deposit rates. Now let me explain the better alternatives to cash that provide wealth preservation and growth potential. Better alternatives to cash provide wealth preservation and growth potential. Treasury inflation-protected securities provide direct inflation protection with government backing comparable to savings accounts. TIPS adjust principal values based on inflation, ensuring purchasing power preservation while providing modest real returns. At JPMorgan, we recommend TIPS allocations of 20% to 30% of conservative portfolios. Dividend-paying stocks from established companies provide income comparable to cash while offering growth potential and inflation protection through dividend increases. High-grade corporate bonds with shorter maturities provide yields substantially above savings rates while maintaining relatively low volatility. Real estate investment trusts provide inflation hedging real asset exposure while generating attractive dividend yields. REITs typically increase distributions with inflation while providing property diversification. Money market funds investing in treasury bills provide slightly higher yields than savings accounts while maintaining comparable safety. Short-term bond funds provide higher yields than money markets while managing duration risk. Portfolio allocation for former cash holdings should limit cash to 3% to 6% of total portfolios rather than the 20% to 40% we often see. Emergency funds should cover 3 to 6 months' expenses but be invested in money market funds or short-term treasuries rather than savings accounts. Medium-term funds for goals 1 to 5 years away should be in short-term bond funds or treasury securities matching investment timelines. long-term funds should be in diversified portfolios, emphasizing growth assets, providing inflation protection and superior returns. The transition from cash to investment alternatives should be gradual to avoid timing risks and allow for education about different investment options. Dollar cost averaging into investment positions over 6 to 12 months reduces the impact of market volatility while building more appropriate portfolio allocations. Risk management requires understanding that investment alternatives involve different risks than cash, including price volatility, credit risk, and liquidity constraints. However, the certainty of purchasing power loss from cash often exceeds the uncertainty of properly diversified investment alternatives. Let me address the common concerns that keep people holding excessive cash despite these risks. Safety concerns about market volatility are valid but must be balanced against the certainty of purchasing power loss from cash. Market volatility is temporary and typically recovers over time, while inflation-driven wealth destruction is permanent and cumulative. Liquidity concerns about accessing funds during emergencies are legitimate but can be addressed through proper asset allocation that maintains adequate liquidity for genuine emergencies while investing longer-term funds more appropriately. Complexity concerns about managing investments beyond simple savings accounts can be addressed through professional financial advice, target date funds, or simple index fund portfolios that require minimal ongoing management while providing superior long-term outcomes. At JPMorgan, we help clients address these concerns through education, gradual transitions, and portfolio structures that provide both safety and growth potential. The key insight is that excessive conservatism has become risky in the current economic environment. FDIC insurance provides protection against bank failures but offers no protection against the more likely risk of purchasing power loss through inflation. The guarantee of nominal principal preservation becomes meaningless when that principal buys significantly less over time. Historical precedents show that periods of financial repression and currency debasement can persist for decades once they become embedded in policy frameworks. The 1970s inflationary period lasted nearly a decade and destroyed substantial wealth for cash holders while benefiting investors in real assets. Now let me explain why this situation is likely to persist for years rather than representing a temporary policy mistake. Government debt dynamics make deflationary policies politically impossible without risking government bankruptcy or social unrest. The mathematics of debt service, entitlement obligations, and infrastructure needs require either substantial tax increases, dramatic spending cuts, or inflationary debt reduction through currency debasement. At JPMorgan, our analysis suggests that political constraints make tax increases and spending cuts insufficient to address fiscal imbalances. The remaining option is allowing inflation to reduce the real burden of government obligations, making continued inflationary bias the most likely policy path. Demographic trends create persistent inflationary pressures through labor shortages, healthcare costs, and Social Security obligations that cannot be addressed through productivity improvements alone. These structural factors suggest inflation above historical averages for the foreseeable future. Deglobalization trends reduce the disinflationary effects of international trade and specialization that help control inflation during the globalization era. Reshoring manufacturing and reducing supply chain vulnerabilities create inflationary pressures that offset technological productivity gains. Global monetary policy coordination prevents any major economy from maintaining truly restrictive monetary policy without damaging currency competitiveness in export industries. This coordination maintains accommodative global monetary conditions that support inflationary trends. The political economy of modern democracies favors policies that provide immediate benefits while deferring cost to future periods. Inflationary policies provide current economic stimulus while imposing costs on cash holders who lack political organization and advocacy. Modern economic theories provide intellectual frameworks that justify extensive government spending and monetary accommodation as necessary for economic stability and growth. These frameworks reduce policymaker resistance to inflationary policies and increase likelihood of continued currency debasement. Financial market infrastructure increasingly depends on continued asset price appreciation to maintain pension fund solvency, insurance company reserves, and banking system stability. This dependence creates systemic pressure for policies that support asset prices through monetary accommodation and fiscal stimulus. International strategic competition provides additional justification for expansive fiscal and monetary policies that maintain domestic economic growth and military capabilities relative to strategic competitors, these geopolitical considerations override traditional concerns about fiscal discipline and monetary restraint. Well, let me conclude with specific action steps for protecting wealth in this environment. Evaluate current cash holdings and determine appropriate allocations based on genuine liquidity needs rather than emotional preferences for perceived safety. Most families can reduce cash holdings from 20% to 40% of assets to 5% to 10% without compromising financial security. Establish emergency funds in money market funds or short-term treasury securities rather than savings accounts to maximize yields while maintaining liquidity for genuine emergencies. These alternatives provide comparable safety with superior returns. Invest medium-term funds in short-term bond funds or individual treasury securities with maturities matching investment timelines. These investments provide higher yields in cash while managing interest rate risk through appropriate duration. Allocate long-term funds to diversified portfolios, emphasizing real assets like stocks, real estate, and inflation-protected securities that provide growth potential and inflation protection over investment periods exceeding 5 years. Consider international diversification to reduce dependence on domestic monetary policy and currency performance. International investments provide protection against domestic policy mistakes while capturing global growth opportunities. At JPMorgan, we help clients implement these strategies through comprehensive financial planning that considers individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and investment objectives. The key insight is that traditional conservative investment approaches have become inappropriate for the current economic environment. Now let me explain why this situation will persist for years rather than representing temporary policy mistakes. Government debt dynamics make deflationary policies politically impossible without risking bankruptcy or social unrest. At JPMorgan, our analysis suggests political constraints make tax increases and spending cuts insufficient to address fiscal imbalances. Demographic trends create persistent inflationary pressures through labor shortages, healthcare costs, and Social Security obligations that cannot be addressed through productivity improvements alone. Deglobalization reduces disinflationary effects of international trade that help control inflation during the globalization era. The transition from cash-heavy portfolios should be gradual and systematic. At JPMorgan, we help clients implement strategies through comprehensive planning, considering individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and investment objectives. Evaluate current cash holdings and determine appropriate allocations based on genuine liquidity needs rather than emotional preferences. Most families can reduce cash from 20% to 40% of assets to 5% to 10% without compromising security. Establish emergency funds in money market funds or short-term treasuries rather than savings accounts. Invest medium-term funds in short-term bond funds or treasury securities, matching investment timelines. Allocate long-term funds to diversified portfolios, emphasizing real assets, providing growth and inflation protection. Consider international diversification to reduce dependence on domestic monetary policy while capturing global growth opportunities. Remember that the greatest risk facing families today isn't market volatility. It's the steady, invisible destruction of purchasing power through excessive cash holdings. The safety of savings accounts is an illusion costing millions their financial futures. Your financial security depends on recognizing that cash has become the most dangerous asset for long-term wealth preservation and taking action to protect purchasing power through intelligent investment strategies. The choice is clear: accept guaranteed wealth destruction through excessive cash holdings, or embrace diversified alternatives providing better protection against persistent inflationary forces reshaping our economy.